Ford has built some of the most legendary vehicles in automotive history, from the Mustang to the F-150, but not every car the company produced was a triumph. Some models were dangerous by design, poorly engineered, or catastrophically flawed, leading to serious accidents and fatalities. These vehicles might have looked impressive on paper or on the showroom floor, but on the streets, they proved deadly. Here are the 9 craziest Ford cars that killed many Americans.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 9. The second-generation Ford Thunderbird, produced from 1958 to 1960, remains one of the most controversial cars in Ford's history. Nicknamed the Square Bird for its sharp, boxy styling, it marked a radical shift from the sporty two-seat original Thunderbird, 1955 to 1957, to a heavier, four-seat, personal luxury car. This change transformed the T-Bird from a nimble American sports roadster into what critics later called a flying couch with no sense of self-preservation. While it was a sales success, its engineering flaws made it one of the most accident-prone cars of its era. Ford executives, driven by market data showing that buyers wanted comfort and prestige over performance, redesigned the Thunderbird with luxury and styling dominance as its main goals. Key design traits of the 1958 to 1960 model included long, low, and wide stance with squared-off proportions, a stark contrast to the curvaceous first-gen car. Massive chrome-laden front fascia and thick roof pillars, emphasizing luxury over agility. Heavier construction, with curb weights climbing above 4,000 pounds, nearly 900 pounds heavier than the 1957 model. Four-seat configuration, marketed as sports car luxury for families. Under the hood, the Square Bird came with big block V8 engines, including the 352 cubic inch, 5.8 liter, and optional 430 cubic inch, 7.0 liter engines paired with automatic transmissions. It was meant to glide down highways, not attack corners. Despite its elegant image, the 1958 to 1960 Thunderbird was notoriously unstable and poorly balanced. Top-heavy design. The new monocoque unibody structure was revolutionary for Ford, but poorly tuned. Combined with the heavy roofline and massive rear overhang, it gave the car a dangerously high center of gravity. Nose heaviness. With a big block V8 up front, most of the weight sat over the front wheels, causing severe understeer and body roll in corners. Weak brakes. Ford equipped the Square Bird with drum brakes that faded quickly under stress, often failing to stop the 4,000-pound car effectively. Suspension tuning issues. Designed for comfort, not control, the soft suspension allowed excessive leaning and unpredictable handling in evasive maneuvers. The result was a car that floated and wallowed on highways, earning its flying couch nickname. Reviewers and owners alike complained that the car wandered at speed, and in sudden turns, it could break traction without warning. By 1960, insurance and safety data showed a troubling trend. The Thunderbird had a high rate of single-vehicle crashes, often involving rollovers or loss of control. The combination of soft suspension, weak brakes, and high weight made it particularly hazardous on wet or uneven roads. Even Ford engineers quietly acknowledged that the Thunderbird's handling was less than ideal. It had no real sense of self-preservation, as one later automotive journalist quipped, a car designed to impress rather than protect. While it sold well, over 200,000 units across 3 years, critics and enthusiasts lambasted the Square Bird for betraying the spirit of the original. The first-generation Thunderbird had been a confident, elegant sports car. The 1958 model was an overstyled boulevard cruiser with little athletic ability. Road and Track summarized it bluntly. The Thunderbird has gone from a bird of prey to a bird that can barely leave the ground. The model's excesses epitomized the late 1950s American trend of chrome, comfort, and size over engineering balance. Despite its flaws, the 1958 to 1960 Thunderbird changed American automotive culture. It created the personal luxury segment, paving the way for cars like the Buick Riviera, Pontiac Grand Prix, and later the Lincoln Continental Mark Series. It proved that style could outsell performance, even when safety and handling suffered. Yet it also became a warning for engineers. No matter how stylish or successful a car might be, poor weight balance and inadequate braking can turn luxury into danger. The Squarebird remains a paradox, a design triumph and an engineering embarrassment. It was bold, profitable, and undeniably glamorous, but it drove like a tank on roller skates. To this day, collectors appreciate its beauty but acknowledge its flaws. It's remembered not just as the car that redefined the Thunderbird, but as the one that nearly grounded it entirely. A flying couch that proved even birds can fall when they forget how to fly.
Number 8. The Ford Fairlane 500, produced between 1957 and 1961, was a symbol of post-war American optimism, a gleaming, chrome-plated dream for middle-class families. Marketed as a step above the base Fairlane, the 500 trim embodied luxury, flash, and pride in American craftsmanship. But beneath the glittering surface, it hid a dangerous flaw: no meaningful safety engineering whatsoever. This was a car built for appearance, not protection. Its rigid steering column, heavy steel frame, and zero crash mitigation meant that even minor accidents could turn catastrophic. In fact, one of its most deadly design choices, the non-collapsible steering shaft, often transformed the steering wheel into a deadly spear during frontal impacts. The Fairlane 500 debuted in 1957, taking its name from Henry Ford's estate in Dearborn, Michigan. Ford's designers sought to make the car look modern, powerful, and upscale, all hallmarks of 1950s consumer culture. Key styling and engineering traits included massive chrome ornamentation from bumper to bumper, including dual headlamps, tail fins, and wide grills. Body-on-frame construction, built from thick-gauge steel, adding weight, but offering little controlled deformation in a crash. Rigid steering column, directly connected to the steering box without a collapsible joint or energy-absorbing feature. Bench seats with no headrests or seat belts, which were optional only in later years and rarely ordered by buyers. Power came from Ford's new Y-block V8 engines, ranging up to 352 cubic inches or 5.8 liters, giving the car decent performance for its size. But its handling was floaty, and its braking performance lagged behind the growing speeds American roads were seeing. The Fairlane 500 was a rolling safety hazard, typical of its time, but worse than many of its peers in one critical aspect: steering column intrusion. When involved in a head-on collision, the rigid steering shaft acted like a spear aimed directly at the driver's chest. The steering column would collapse inward through the steering wheel, impaling the driver or causing fatal chest injuries. There was no energy absorption, no crumple zones, and no safety padding. The dashboard and wheel were metal, the windshield unlaminated, and the front structure so rigid it transferred impact forces straight into the cabin. Even low-speed collisions often resulted in serious injury. Engineers knew of these risks. Safety advocates like Harley Earl at GM and Robert McNamara at Ford had begun discussing safety features by the late 1950s. But Ford's marketing division feared such discussions would hurt sales by reminding buyers of danger. So the Fairlane 500 stayed exactly as it was: big, beautiful, and brutally unsafe. Crash testing was not standardized in the late 1950s. But later reconstructions and safety analyses of Fairlane-era Fords revealed terrifying results. In a 30-mile-per-hour frontal impact, the steering shaft often penetrated the driver's torso area by 8 to 12 inches.
The dashboard and windshield frame caused severe facial and skull injuries. The doors frequently jammed shut due to frame distortion, trapping occupants after a crash. In collisions with lighter vehicles, the Fairlane's stiff frame often destroyed the smaller car but absorbed little energy itself, leaving passengers to take the full brunt of inertia. It's important to understand why such cars existed. In the late 1950s, style and power sold cars, not safety. The public wanted the flashiest, heaviest, most space-age-looking machine their paycheck could buy. Ford's ads boasted of solid steel beauty and the car built for tomorrow, yet made no mention of seat belts, steering safety, or crash survivability. The automaker even resisted adding optional seat belts until government pressure began mounting in the early 1960s. The Fairlane 500, especially in two-tone colors with full chrome trim, became a symbol of this mindset. Elegance first, safety last. By 1961, the Fairlane nameplate was losing ground to newer, smaller models. Ford replaced it with a more modern unibody Fairlane in 1962, which offered slightly better safety and structural integrity, though still primitive by modern standards. Ironically, many surviving 1957 to 1961 Fairlane 500s are now prized by collectors for their craftsmanship and nostalgic styling. Yet anyone who's driven one knows the steering column sits too close, the dash is a steel wall, and the seatbelts, if retrofitted, feel almost symbolic. Today, the 1957 to 1961 Ford Fairlane 500 stands as a monument to the pre-safety era of American motoring, when weight and shine were mistaken for protection. It was a car designed in the image of power and prestige, but built without the slightest understanding of occupant safety. Automotive historians often cite it as an example of how design excess and ignorance of physics defined the 1950s. The steering column spear problem became one of the key motivators for the introduction of collapsible steering columns in 1967, following public outrage and federal safety regulations. The Ford Fairlane 500 was beautiful, bold, and tragically flawed. A chrome-colored cruiser that concealed a spear beneath its steering wheel. It represents a time when automakers chased glamour and horsepower while ignoring the human body's limits. And though it helped define an era of style, it also served as a grim reminder that safety can't be optional when lives are at stake.
Number 7. When Ford introduced the Galaxie 500 at the dawn of the 1960s, it was meant to represent the pinnacle of American family motoring. Large, powerful, elegant, and above all, safe. Advertisements boasted of solid steel construction, family-sized comfort, and Ford's famous reliability. But behind this confident image lay one of the most misleading safety reputations of its era. The Galaxie 500 was massive, yes, but not genuinely safe. Its enormous weight, outdated braking system, and crude steering geometry made it dangerous in the hands of ordinary drivers. At highway speeds, its drum brakes faded quickly, steering response lagged, and its rigid steering column posed a lethal risk in a crash. Ford sold confidence, but delivered complacency. The Ford Galaxie 500 was first introduced in 1959 and evolved throughout the 1960s as Ford's flagship full-size model, positioned above the Fairlane. The name Galaxie captured the nation's fascination with the space race, a time when Americans dreamed of rockets, satellites, and futuristic living. By the mid-1960s, the Galaxie 500 had become a bestseller. It was available as a coupe, sedan, or convertible, with engines ranging from a mild 223 cubic inch straight-six to the thunderous 427 cubic inch V8 used in Ford's NASCAR racing program. Yet for all its glamour and muscle, the Galaxie 500 was a technological paradox. Powerful enough to reach triple-digit speeds, but equipped with braking and safety systems that belonged to the previous decade. Ford heavily marketed the Galaxie as a safe family car, playing on the psychology that larger vehicles equaled greater protection. And in minor fender benders, that seemed true. The car's heavy frame usually came away with less visible damage than a smaller rival. But in real-world crashes or emergency maneuvers, that weight turned deadly. Drum brakes on all four wheels were standard through much of the 1960s. They were prone to fading under repeated braking, particularly on long downhill grades or highway deceleration. A fully loaded Galaxie 500 traveling 70 miles per hour required over 200 feet to stop, and sometimes more when brakes overheated. No power-assisted disc brakes were available on early models, meaning pedal pressure was immense and stopping power inconsistent. The car's overboosted power steering offered almost no feedback, creating a vague, floaty feel at high speeds. Emergency swerves often resulted in loss of control. This combination, speed, weight, and poor control, made the Galaxie 500 a hazard in the growing world of 1960s interstate travel. Like many cars of its era, the Galaxie 500 used a non-collapsible steering column directly connected to the steering gearbox. In a frontal collision, the engine and steering shaft could push backward into the driver's chest. Accident investigators in the mid-1960s repeatedly found steering wheel intrusions in Galaxie crashes, crushed rib cages, punctured lungs, and internal trauma caused by the steering hub. The danger became so well documented that when the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, began forming safety standards later in the decade, collapsible steering columns were one of the first federally mandated features, starting with 1967 models. In performance form, particularly the 427 and 428 V8 versions, the Galaxie 500 could exceed 130 miles per hour. But its suspension and chassis design were tuned for comfort, not control. At high speed, the following problems were common. Body roll in corners was extreme due to soft springs and long overhangs. Brake fade could occur after just 2 or 3 hard stops from highway speeds. The steering ratio was so slow that full lock-to-lock turns required more than 4 rotations, making quick corrections nearly impossible. Even test drivers in period reviews, including those from Car and Driver and Motor Trend, noted that the Galaxie feels like it weighs twice as much as it should and handles like a cruise ship in a storm. The Galaxie 500 perfectly illustrated the 1960s American misunderstanding of vehicle safety. Automakers sold mass and metal as protection. Advertisements featured families sitting on the hood, children playing near chrome bumpers, and slogans like, "Built like the cars that win a Daytona, safe, strong, Ford tough." But the truth was grim. Without crumple zones, energy-absorbing steering, or proper seatbelt anchoring, the Galaxie's rigid frame transmitted impact forces directly to the occupants. The car's weight did little to save the driver in head-on or side impacts. It only increased the kinetic energy involved. By the late 1960s, insurance and safety studies revealed the uncomfortable reality. The Galaxie 500's fatality rate per mile was higher than that of smaller, more modern compacts like the Falcon or Mustang. Police crash reports often described Galaxies as unrecoverable once momentum builds, a polite way of saying they didn't stop or turn fast enough to avoid disaster. When drum brakes failed on downhill grades, the car's weight ensured that collisions were often catastrophic. And in multi-vehicle crashes, its height and stiffness made it a battering ram against smaller cars, causing horrific secondary injuries. By the early 1970s, the Galaxie 500's era had passed. It was replaced by safer, slightly more modern designs, and the introduction of federal safety regulations in 1968 forced Ford to adopt features like collapsible steering columns, dual-circuit braking systems, energy-absorbing dashboards, seatbelt anchorage points. But the lessons learned from the Galaxie years lingered. It became a case study in how not to build a safe car, proving that size and power could not substitute for engineering and foresight. Today, surviving Galaxie 500s are admired for their classic beauty and historical charm, but even collectors acknowledge the danger. Few would dare to drive one daily on modern highways. The 1960s Ford Galaxie 500 was a product of misplaced faith in mass and metal, a car that promised family safety but delivered a false sense of security. Its long stopping distances, weak brakes, and deadly steering column made it a rolling contradiction of the very values it claimed to uphold. In many ways, it symbolized the end of an era, when Americans' obsession with power and prestige finally collided, quite literally, with the need for science-based safety. The Galaxie 500 remains a reminder that true safety is not about size. It's about design.
Number 6. The 1972-1976 Ford LTD stood as the ultimate expression of America's early 70s obsession with size, comfort, and chrome. At over 19 feet long and nearly 5,000 pounds, it was one of the largest sedans Ford had ever produced, a land yacht in every sense. Advertisements called it the quiet world of LTD and promised unmatched security and smoothness. But behind that tranquil image was a false sense of safety and shocking engineering neglect that made it one of the most dangerous full-size cars of its era. During the early 1970s, American automakers, and Ford especially, clung to a belief that mass equaled safety. Consumers were told that a big car would protect them better in an accident simply because of its size and steel thickness. Ford leaned heavily into that idea with the LTD, portraying it as a family fortress on wheels. However, the physics of crash safety told a different story. Without crumple zones, collapsible steering columns, or energy-absorbing interiors, the LTD's rigid structure transferred crash forces directly to the passengers. In other words, the car survived the crash, but the people inside often didn't. Platform, Ford's full-size B-body architecture, also shared with the Mercury Marquis. Engines ranged from the 351 Windsor V8 to the enormous 460 cubic inch 7.5-liter V8, with power ranging from 153 to 219 horsepower net. Transmission, 3-speed Cruise-O-Matic automatic only. Brakes, front discs and rear drums, barely adequate for the vehicle's bulk. Curb weight, 4,600 to 5,200 pounds, depending on trim. On paper, it was comfortable and powerful enough for interstate cruising. In reality, its handling was dreadful, braking distances excessive, and steering dangerously vague. One of the most lethal issues with the 1972 through 1976 LTD was its steering column design. Although Ford had introduced collapsible steering columns in the late 60s, early versions were primitive. In the LTD, column and steering shaft failures during crashes often caused the column to collapse in the wrong direction, toward the driver's chest. The sheer weight of the car meant that during a head-on collision, the steering wheel and dashboard frequently became lethal projectiles. Crash investigators and insurance data from the mid-1970s documented numerous impalement injuries from steering shafts and broken steering wheel hubs in Ford's big sedans, the LTD included. Independent crash testing and insurance studies in the mid-1970s, notably by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, IIHS, and consumer advocates like Ralph Nader's team, revealed the LTD's grim truth. Frontal impact tests at 30 miles per hour resulted in severe intrusion into the cabin, with the steering wheel driven into the driver's torso. Dashboard and steering column collapses caused fatal chest injuries. The steel dashboard frame lacked any meaningful padding or energy absorption. Seatbelt anchor points often tore free of the floor during high-impact crashes. Despite Ford's advertising claims, the LTD consistently scored near the bottom in simulated crash survivability compared to smaller, better-engineered vehicles. The LTD's enormous front-mounted V8 made the car severely nose-heavy. Combined with its long wheelbase and soft suspension, this resulted in alarming understeer and brake fade. In real-world terms, emergency stopping distances exceeded 220 feet from 60 miles per hour. Sudden steering corrections often caused the car to plow straight ahead instead of turning. Weight transfer under braking overloaded the front tires and brakes, which overheated easily.
Drivers often described it as trying to stop a freight train with bicycle brakes. On wet roads, the LTD became nearly unmanageable. Ford's marketing worked too well. Many buyers believed the LTD's bulk and luxury features made it one of the safest family cars available. The wide bench seats, thick chrome, and solid doors gave the impression of protection. But in truth, the LTD represented old-world thinking in a new regulatory era. After the federal safety reforms of 1968, the car's design lagged behind the growing standards for crash safety. Its luxury batting hid dangerous steel edges, and its massive size made it even deadlier in multi-vehicle collisions, not just to its passengers, but to others on the road. Insurance data from 1974 through 1976 showed that Ford full-size sedans had some of the highest injury severity ratings per crash among domestic vehicles. By 1976, America's fascination with giant sedans was fading fast. The OPEC oil crisis, rising fuel prices, and growing awareness of safety and emissions issues turned the LTD into a symbol of automotive excess: big, outdated, and dangerous. As Ford prepared for downsizing in 1977, engineers quietly admitted that the old LTD chassis couldn't be adapted to meet new federal crash and fuel standards. It was simply too heavy, too crude, and too risky to evolve. Today, the 1972 through 1976 Ford LTD is remembered fondly by some collectors for its plush interiors, powerful V8s, and smooth ride. But safety experts see it as one of the last relics of a misguided design era. It perfectly captures the contradiction of 1970s American automotive culture: comfort and confidence on the outside, hidden danger beneath. Modern enthusiasts often refer to it as a rolling living room, and not without reason. Its wide seats, velvet upholstery, and quiet V8 hum made it feel like a sofa on wheels. Unfortunately, that same metaphor extended to its crash performance. Like a living room set, it looked inviting but offered little real protection when things went wrong. The 1972 through 1976 Ford LTD remains a sobering reminder that bulk and luxury can't replace safety engineering. Its steering column failures, poor braking, and false promise of size-based safety made it one of the most deceptively dangerous sedans of its day. It symbolized the end of America's bigger is better illusion, a final chrome-plated warning that mass without control is just momentum waiting for a crash. Number 5. The 1971-1980 Ford Pinto stands as one of the darkest chapters in American automotive history. A car whose engineering flaws and corporate decisions cost human lives and forever changed how the public viewed safety in automobiles. It wasn't just a bad car, it became a symbol of moral and industrial failure. In the late 1960s, foreign subcompacts like the Volkswagen Beetle, Toyota Corolla, and Datsun 510 were flooding the U.S. market. Ford rushed to respond. Lee Iacocca, then a rising executive, wanted a cheap, lightweight American car that could retail for under $2,000 and weigh less than 2,000 pounds. The now infamous 2000 project. Development moved at record-breaking speed, just 25 months from concept to showroom, compared to the usual 43 months. Corners were cut everywhere, including in safety testing. The Pinto's fatal flaw was its fuel tank placement. Engineers mounted the gas tank behind the rear axle, barely 9 inches from the rear bumper, a recipe for disaster. In rear-end collisions over 25 miles per hour, the filler neck could tear loose, or the tank itself could puncture against exposed bolts and sharp edges on the differential and rear structure. Worse, there was no real shielding, no reinforcement between the tank and the back bumper. The result, even minor rear impacts could rupture the tank, spraying gasoline under the car, which was then ignited by sparks from crushed electrical components or hot exhaust. Crash tests conducted before production clearly showed this hazard. Several prototypes burst into flames during testing, yet Ford executives, fearing delays and costs, chose not to fix it. The most damning evidence came later in the form of Ford's Pinto memo, a cost-benefit analysis submitted to the U.S. Department of Transportation. It calculated that fixing the defect, an $11 per car shield or bladder system, would cost about $137 million, whereas expected legal settlements from burn deaths and injuries would total $49.5 million. In other words, it was cheaper to let people die than to fix the car. When this internal memo surfaced in the late 1970s, it ignited a national outrage and became a textbook case of corporate indifference. The Pinto's flaw wasn't theoretical, it was deadly real. Numerous fatal accidents involved Pintos exploding after being rear-ended. One of the most infamous was the 1978 Indiana case, where 3 teenage girls were burned alive when their Pinto was struck from behind. Ford was later charged with reckless homicide, an unprecedented move for an automaker. Though the company was acquitted, the damage to its reputation was irreversible. Public outrage and lawsuits forced Ford to recall 1.5 million Pintos in 1978, one of the largest recalls in history at the time. The scandal reshaped public perception of Ford and, more importantly, transformed automotive safety regulation in the U.S. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, began enforcing stricter fuel system integrity standards and demanded more transparency in crash data. Corporate liability law also evolved, emphasizing duty of care over profit-based risk analysis. The Pinto became more than just a failed car. It became a case study in business ethics still taught today in law, engineering, and MBA programs worldwide. It also destroyed Ford's image as the car for the people and made consumers far more skeptical about safety claims from any automaker. Even decades later, Pinto remains a synonym for explosive danger and corporate cover-up. It proved that a car could kill not just with mechanical flaws, but with moral ones. A chilling reminder that ethics and engineering must go hand in hand.
Number 4. The Ford Country Squire, 1955 to 1974, was one of America's most iconic family wagons, a rolling symbol of post-war suburbia. With its wood grain panels, chrome trim, and seating for up to 9, it embodied the optimism of the 1950s and 1960s American dream. But behind that image of comfort and practicality was a dangerously flawed machine, underbraked, overweight, and prone to deadly handling failures when pushed beyond its limits. The Country Squire was the flagship of Ford's station wagon lineup, marketed as the car for big American families with big American dreams. Its trademark simulated wood grain sides, first real wood, later vinyl applique, made it instantly recognizable in driveways and parking lots across the country. By the mid-1960s, the Country Squire had grown enormous. Based on the full-sized Galaxie and later LTD platforms, it shared mechanicals with Ford's biggest sedans and often weighed over 4,500 pounds. And that was before adding passengers, luggage, or a trailer. The problem? The braking and suspension systems didn't keep up with that weight. Until 1973, every Country Squire relied on four-wheel drum brakes, technology dating back to the 1930s. These brakes faded badly under heat, especially on long downhill grades or when the car was loaded. Owners towing boats or campers often found that stopping distances doubled and pedal fade could set in after just 1 or 2 hard stops. When tested by Consumer Reports in the 1960s, a loaded Country Squire took nearly 200 feet to stop from 60 miles per hour, far longer than its European or even domestic rivals. Under emergency braking, the car's nose-heavy front end would dive, reducing rear traction and making the back end swing dangerously wide. Even Ford engineers acknowledged the limits of its chassis. The wagon's rear leaf springs were too soft for heavy towing, yet too stiff for comfort when empty, resulting in unpredictable handling.
Many country Squires were used for towing trailers or boats thanks to Ford's marketing emphasis on vacation freedom. But the car's braking capacity and cooling system were easily overwhelmed under load. Numerous state accident reports from the 1960s and early 1970s cite brake fade and trailer sway as common causes in fatal crashes involving the model. Owners also frequently overloaded the rear cargo area, which could shift the car's weight distribution dangerously rearward, worsening its already marginal stability. On winding roads or high-speed descents, the combination of drum brake fade, high center of gravity, and poor weight balance was a recipe for disaster. By the early 1970s, the country Squire was being outclassed by competitors, offering front disc brakes and better safety engineering. But Ford clung to the old formula: massive size, minimal safety features, and marketing aimed at nostalgia rather than innovation. When federal safety regulations tightened in the late 1960s, the country Squire's sheer mass ironically worked against it. In frontal crashes, the steering column could drive straight into the driver's chest, and the absence of headrests in earlier years increased whiplash injuries. Rear passengers, especially those in the third row way back, were practically sitting in the crumple zone. Ford's ads proudly called the country Squire America's safest family wagon. But in practice, its weight and power made it deceptive. Families assumed big meant safe, until the brakes failed, the steering column collapsed, or the suspension buckled under load. Crash investigators in the 1960s noted a disturbing trend. The heavier the load, the worse the outcome. In many collisions, the momentum of the 2.5-ton wagon overwhelmed its structure, crushing the front bulkhead or driving the steering box into the cabin. The country Squire remained on sale until 1991, but its 1955 to 1974 era defined its reputation, both as a cultural icon and a mechanical hazard. It starred in countless family road trips, TV shows, and nostalgic ads, yet it was also part of a generation of cars that prioritized size and image over safety. By the late 1970s, with fuel crises and new safety standards, the age of the giant wood-paneled wagon was fading fast. It was replaced by downsized models and, eventually, minivans, vehicles far safer and more efficient. The Ford Country Squire will always be remembered fondly for its style and family-friendly appeal, but it also stands as a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked automotive excess. It was the family car that couldn't stop. Number 3. The Ford Torino, 1968 to 1971, was a car built for speed, but not for control. Conceived during Detroit's golden age of horsepower, it promised family car comfort with muscle car performance. In practice, it often delivered chaos. The Torino's massive engines, crude suspension, and nose-heavy balance made it thrilling in a straight line and terrifying in almost any other situation. Introduced in 1968 as a step up from the Fairlane, the Torino quickly became Ford's mid-size performance flagship. The lineup escalated fast. By 1970, you could order one with the 429 Cobra Jet V8, producing well over 370 horsepower. With drag strip levels of torque, the Torino was capable of 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 6 seconds, an astonishing figure for its class. The problem was that the chassis and suspension were never designed for that power. The Torino was built on a platform originally engineered for moderate family sedans. Ford simply bolted in enormous engines without adequately upgrading the structure, brakes, or handling systems to match. The result? A front-heavy brute that understeered violently, nosedived under braking, and lost traction unpredictably on corners. A fully equipped Torino Cobra Jet weighed nearly 4,000 pounds, with much of that mass over the front axle. This imbalance caused severe understeer, the car's tendency to plow forward in turns even when the steering wheel was turned. Reviewers at the time described it as fighting physics just to stay on a curve. The steering was slow and vague, requiring multiple turns lock to lock, and the soft suspension, tuned more for ride comfort than racing precision, let the body roll heavily during cornering. Combined with bias-ply tires of the era, which offered limited grip, the Torino became extremely unstable at high speeds. Drivers often found themselves overcorrecting after understeer transitions, causing sudden fishtailing or total loss of control, especially above 100 miles per hour. The Torino's drum brakes were wholly inadequate for the car's weight and speed. In multiple road tests, braking performance was described as dangerously inconsistent. After a few hard stops, the drums would fade badly, requiring longer pedal travel and dramatically increased stopping distances. Some later models offered front discs as an option, but even these systems struggled to rein in the 429's power. At highway speeds, the Torino's brakes could overheat within minutes, leading to runaway conditions on long downhill roads. Highway patrol reports from the early 1970s documented numerous fatal accidents involving Torinos and other big block intermediates. The pattern was consistent: excessive speed, loss of control, and failure to brake effectively before impact. The car's crash safety structure was primitive by modern standards. There were no crumple zones, and steering columns were rigid, meaning a front-end collision often drove the column directly into the driver's chest. Combined with lap belts and often no shoulder restraints, many Torino crashes turned fatal even at moderate speeds. Ford marketed the Torino as a blend of luxury and lightning, a car that could haul the family and still dominate the drag strip. But in reality, it was a car that outran its engineering. The Cobra Jet variants in particular could reach speeds that the chassis simply wasn't built to handle safely. Motoring journalists of the day praised its raw power, but warned that it was a muscle car in desperate need of modern brakes and suspension. Even racing teams that used the Torino platform had to heavily modify it to survive competition, replacing nearly every major mechanical component just to make it trackworthy. By 1972, the muscle car era was collapsing under emissions laws, insurance crackdowns, and rising fuel prices. The Torino grew even heavier and slower, and its wildest engines disappeared. Ford quietly phased it out after 1976, replacing it with more sedate models. Yet the legacy of the 1968 to 1971 Torino remains controversial. For some, it's a symbol of raw American power, untamed and glorious. For others, it's a reminder of how recklessly Detroit pushed horsepower without responsibility. The Torino could thrill any driver brave enough to floor it, but too often, it also killed them. It was a muscle car that went faster than it could ever safely stop or steer.
Number 2. The Ford Ranchero GT, 1967 to 1971, was one of the most unusual vehicles of its time, a hybrid between a muscle car and a pickup truck. On paper, it promised the best of both worlds, the performance and looks of a sporty coupe with the practicality of a small truck bed. In practice, however, it often delivered the worst of both, particularly in the area of safety. Underneath its flashy paint and GT stripes lurked a dangerously unbalanced design, one that made it prone to fishtailing, rollovers, and loss of control at high speeds. While it became a cult classic in later decades, the Ranchero GT of this era was a handling hazard waiting to happen. The Ranchero originated in 1957 as a quirky solution for customers who wanted something that could both haul and commute. By 1967, Ford had restyled it on the Fairlane and later Torino platform, giving it a long hood, a powerful V8, and the GT package, including optional 390 and 428 cubic inch engines. That meant serious horsepower, up to 335 horsepower, in a vehicle that still retained the light, unweighted rear of a pickup bed. The result was an imbalance in weight distribution that was far more severe than even the muscle cars of its day. Nearly 60% of the Ranchero's mass sat over the front axle, leaving the rear dangerously light and prone to breaking traction during sudden acceleration or cornering.
At low speeds, the Ranchero GT behaved like any big American car, smooth and easygoing. But when pushed, especially with the big V8s, it became unpredictable and dangerous. Drivers frequently reported rear-end swing or complete fishtails under throttle, particularly on wet or loose surfaces. In high-speed turns or evasive maneuvers, the Ranchero's rear suspension could hop or skip across the pavement, reducing traction even further. Combined with primitive tires and a softly tuned suspension, the GT version was incredibly unstable above 80 miles per hour. Adding to the problem, Ford equipped it with recirculating ball steering, which was slow and imprecise, requiring large corrections that could easily trigger oversteer. The long wheelbase made recovery from slides difficult, and once the rear started swinging, the Ranchero could spin out or tip over entirely. Contemporary accident data and insurance records from the late 1960s reveal a troubling trend. The Ranchero GT was overrepresented in single-vehicle rollovers and off-road crashes, especially among young male drivers. The cause was simple. Many buyers treated the Ranchero GT like a muscle car, racing it, overloading it, or performing high-speed stunts. But its chassis was more truck than sports car. When the rear tires lost traction, momentum carried the lightweight bed upward, sometimes causing the entire vehicle to roll during spinouts or hard cornering. The lack of rollover protection, no structural reinforcements behind the cab, and no crumple zones made such accidents often fatal. Braking was another weak point. Most Ranchero GTs came with front drum brakes until 1970, and even optional front discs were marginal for the car's weight and speed potential. Stopping distances were alarmingly long, and brake fade was common during downhill driving or repeated stops. The steering column had no collapsible joint in earlier models, a serious risk in front-end collisions as it could impale the driver. Seat belts were rudimentary, and the bench seating provided minimal lateral support, making it harder for drivers to maintain control during slides. Ford's advertising sold the Ranchero GT as the perfect blend of work and play, targeting younger buyers with muscle car aspirations. Ads showed it roaring down highways with surfboards in the back, the image of freedom and speed. But in reality, it was a vehicle with mismatched priorities. Its truck-based rear suspension wasn't tuned for the aggressive driving style that Ford encouraged in its marketing, and its front-heavy balance made it inherently unstable when driven hard. By 1971, the Ranchero had grown even larger and heavier, further blurring the line between performance car and pickup. After safety and emissions regulations tightened in the early 1970s, Ford quietly shifted the model toward comfort and utility rather than speed. Today, the Ranchero GT is remembered fondly by collectors for its uniqueness and muscular style. But among engineers and historians, it's also recognized as one of the least stable performance vehicles Ford ever sold. Its combination of power, poor balance, and minimal safety made it a thrill ride for the brave and a deadly trap for the reckless. It was, quite literally, half car, half truck, half safe. Number 1. The Ford Courier, 1972 to 1982, was a compact pickup introduced to give American buyers a small, fuel-efficient alternative to the traditional F-Series trucks. It was essentially a rebadged Mazda B-Series, imported from Japan and marketed under the Ford badge. While the Courier was praised for its maneuverability and economy, it had serious structural and safety flaws that made it deadly in collisions, particularly in rural areas where small pickups were often used for work. The Courier was lightweight and compact, often weighing less than 2,200 pounds, with a short wheelbase and small cabin. While this made it excellent for tight city streets and light-duty hauling, it also meant that crash energy had little structure to absorb it. The truck lacked robust side impact beams, crumple zones, and reinforced cab frames. In collisions with larger vehicles or stationary objects, the front end would collapse directly into the passenger compartment. Many drivers and passengers experienced severe chest trauma, head injuries, or even fatalities in what would have been minor accidents in heavier American trucks. Front-end collisions. The Courier's light front structure offered minimal protection. When hitting a standard sedan, the cab would deform catastrophically, crushing occupants. Side impacts. Without side beams or reinforced door structures, side collisions often resulted in doors being pushed inward, directly injuring passengers. Rollovers. The short wheelbase and high center of gravity when loaded made the truck prone to tipping during abrupt maneuvers. While rare compared to frontal crashes, any rollover was often deadly due to the thin roof. In rural areas, Couriers were often used as work trucks, carrying farm equipment, tools, and small trailers. Overloading the vehicle exacerbated instability, particularly on winding roads or gravel surfaces. Many insurance and accident reports from the 1970s note that Courier drivers suffered severe injuries in low-speed collisions that would have been survivable in a heavier pickup. The combination of lightweight foreign construction and U.S.-style traffic hazards made it a dangerous vehicle for American drivers who were accustomed to sturdier domestic trucks. Ford advertised the Courier as compact, practical, and economical, highlighting fuel efficiency and ease of parking. The company made little effort to modify the truck's structure for U.S. safety standards beyond basic bumper reinforcement. Unlike American trucks, which were built with heavy-duty frames and thick steel cabins, the Courier was designed for light-duty Japanese roads, a mismatch for U.S. work environments. The emphasis on economy sacrificed structural integrity, creating a vehicle that was cute and convenient but unsafe under real-world conditions. While the Courier helped Ford enter the small truck market and paved the way for later U.S.-built compact pickups, it became notorious among safety advocates. Its poor crashworthiness highlighted the need for imported vehicles to meet domestic crash standards long before NHTSA regulations tightened in the 1980s. Today, the Courier is remembered as a quaint, economical pickup, but also as a warning about the dangers of lightweight trucks without proper safety engineering. For rural workers and city drivers alike, it was a vehicle that performed its job in terms of hauling and fuel economy, yet carried hidden risks that sometimes proved fatal.